Welcome back to another episode of Novelio. Today is Wednesday, May 26th, 2021. I'm going to continue on with my reading of Hot Winter Sun. Holidays were hushed and subdued that year in most of England, but at Briarwood and in many Cornwall neighbourhoods, people were determined to stay merry for as long as possible. Jennifer scheduled the usual dinners and invited guests. Inevitably, however, 1646 began with much tumult. It was clear that there were only a few castles able to stand out against the parliamentarian army, such as Pendennis and St. Mawes, but it was rumoured that Lieutenant Bonnython would soon surrender St. Mawes to the Roundheads. It was only a matter of time before Cornwall would be under siege again, and without those stronghold castles, little hope of a victory could be expected. Unlike 1644, when the Cavaliers were able to drive the somewhat disorganized soldiers from their territory, there was no longer enough support for the king or adequate organization to repeat that scenario. Most men knew what this meant, and landowners now sat discussing strategies for either a quick exodus or a way to remain and keep their properties by declaring themselves for Cromwell. Julian left his study in search of Catherine, but when he heard the ladies laughing together, he had not the heart to broach the subject of war. "What is this raucous laughter I can hear all the way from my study?" he said, with a smile, coming to Jennifer's room where various materials and lace were laid out on the bed. "Clarissa's 15th birthday is on Monday," Jennifer said, "and we want to make her the finest gown she has ever had." Before Julian could answer, Carissa said, "It should be a deep marigold color with russet trim to highlight her auburn hair." Catherine turned to Jennifer and Carissa and said, "You will have her spoiled between you. She already has a fine assortment of gowns from which to choose." "Oh, but this birthday is especially important, as it may be the last such occasion at Briarwood for a long time, and the poor thing did not even tell us last year when it was her birthday. She let the day pass unnoticed." Jennifer replied. Catherine looked helplessly to Julian. "Do not involve me," he said. "I certainly have not spoiled her, but I do think a new dress is in order for her ball. Naturally, I will leave you ladies to plan the details regarding fabrics and fripperies, as I fear I would be of little help in that regard. But I would love to be the one to tell her she is to have a true ball. If that is acceptable to you, Kathy?" "Oh, do please. She will be very happy to hear it from you. She knows we're celebrating no matter what, but I have kept it a secret that she is to have an actual ball. Her first! Imagine it." "I remember mine," said Jennifer. I never had one," Carissa said, and Catherine thought she saw that old twist of bitterness on her lips that she had not seen in quite some time, since Harold, to be precise. "Well, you were very much against the idea, Carissa," Julian said, not unkindly, "and you said you would not attend if we held one against your wishes." "I know," replied Carissa, "but can't I regret it after the fact?" Then she suddenly laughed, as did everyone else, to prevent an awkward moment. But when she left the room for a moment, Jennifer said, "I wonder if we should have done more to force her to be sociable when she was younger." "I think we did all we could in the absence of dragging her to parties and balls, kicking and screaming," Julian replied. "She had absolutely no interest in it, and I wouldn't have felt right forcing her into situations she would detest. I still remember how long it took her to tolerate dinner parties when she was old enough to attend. She was always a bit difficult. I think Catherine understands her better than anyone, but even you are puzzled by her behavior sometimes, are you not?" Jennifer said, looking at Catherine. "She can be a bit hard to know. Sometimes I think we're becoming good friends, and then other times she seems distant, even hostile. Well, none of us are perfect, and there was that unfortunate incident with Harold losing interest in her." Catherine trailed off. "That's true," Jennifer said, realizing Catherine's discomfort, "but it's difficult to help someone if that person is intent on shutting you out. I think you've been very kind to her." At length they got back to the task at hand. Ultimately the ball went off beautifully, and Clarissa was clearly destined to shine at such gatherings and was one of the best dancers in the room. She even danced with Paul and Julian and ended up leading, as they did not have the latest steps mastered. To everyone's intense amusement, Clarissa announced that they would both need dance instruction and couldn't understand how they managed balls thus far without it. During the party, Carissa had asked Julian to help her fasten a shutter that was banging in the wind, and as they turned the corner, they came upon Clarissa and one of her friends desperately trying to piece back together a vase that had apparently been overturned and broken. This is always what I feared, Clarissa said, close to tears. That someday I would do something dreadful here and find myself in desperate trouble. Her friend Fiona hurriedly picked up more pieces and said, Should you find Janet or Rose? Perhaps they would have some way to put it back together and no one will notice. As long as they would keep our secret. Then, hearing her friend's sudden intake of breath, she followed Clarissa's eyes to Julian and Carinza, who were standing there, trying not to smile. Julian spoke before anyone could say anything. So that ghastly thing has finally met its end. I'm glad the fool object is gone. I can think of several other pieces that would look better there. The girls looked startled at first, as if his reaction was too good to be true, but Clarissa finally found her tongue and said, I caught my foot on the stand. We were coming around that narrow corner and probably should have went singly, but we were arm in arm and I guess I was clumsy. At this point, Fiona immediately began explaining why it was her fault and not Clarissa's. Well, have done, Julian said. We're well rid of it. I couldn't be happier. Could you, Carrie? It was all Carinza could do to refrain from bursting out in laughter, but she simply agreed, saying she would go find someone to dispose of it and put something more attractive in its place. When she left and the girls returned to the party, Julian suddenly found himself face to face with Catherine. Gliding about the home like a ghost, are you? He asked, as I once accused you of in the days when you despised me. And from the looks of it, you've once again been charging through the manor like a horse gone mad. I believe it was, Julian finished, and Catherine's face broke into a smile, remembering that long-ago altercation. It was indeed, she replied. However, I know it was not you who broke the vase, whether you've been charging about or not. I heard the entire episode as I was coming along. Well, he said, momentarily at a loss for words, well, I never did like that piece. It's rather ugly. Or could that merely be an excuse because you didn't want the girls upset? He tried to think of a quick answer but was not able to do so, and Catherine spoke again. For all your fierceness, Julian, you're sometimes the sweetest man God ever made. Ah, so you think he was correct to have made two of us after all? She looked at him for a moment and then said, I take it back. You are a beast to remind me of that hard thing I said so long ago. But even as she spoke, she wound her arms around his neck. My Catherine loves me indeed, if she can call me names, yet pull me into her arms. You have a passion for me, Kathy, which you can no longer hide, he said, attempting to kiss her, but she pulled away. Someone might come, she said. Well, if you do not want to kiss me, if you do not want me to kiss you, I would suggest that you leave at once. This she did, but the dazzling smile she gave him over her shoulder made him want to chase her down the hall. That woman will be my undoing one day, as sure as I live and breathe. After the guests departed and Clarissa and Matthew were in bed, Catherine wandered along the balcony, smiling when she saw the ridiculous trinket that had been placed on the stand where the broken vase had sat. She thought how differently their lives had turned out from where they started in her father's home, where parties and balls were sinful and laughter against the rules. Her mind suddenly went back to those dreadful years, and in a rare moment of self-indulgence she wondered how long it would take for all the painful memories to fade. Kathy, are you quite all right? Julian's voice came from the area of the gallery. Yes, just wandering, I suppose, she said as he wrapped his arms around her and pulled her back against him. What are you thinking, sweetheart? He asked. That you should not hold me this way. Are you afraid of me or yourself? He asked. Myself, she answered, and her simple honesty touched him. He pulled her against him even closer and put his lips by her ear. I love you, Kathy, with all my heart. I love you too, Julian. His hands slid from her shoulders down her arms to her wrists. I never saw a more beautifully formed woman than you. You look like a French sculptor carved you out of marble. You're too perfect to be real. You are fanciful, absurdly so. Every word is true. My heart cannot hold all the love I have for you, but I can't think how I could satisfy you for a lifetime. As if you could fail. You say preposterous things, he replied, pulling her hair aside and kissing the back of her neck. Heaven save me if that's not just what Robert always did. Don't, Julian, I can't fall in love with you any deeper. My heart will break. I should distance myself to give you time to make sure you really want me. Another absurd statement, although I have come to expect them from my mystifying cat. I will fully understand you some day. I don't pretend to now. I only know these fears are unfounded, and I will drive them away bit by bit. There was a softness in his voice she would not have thought possible for him. This, of all things, took her off guard, and she suddenly turned around, reaching for him. "Julian, my love," she whispered as he caught her in a tight embrace and kissed her again and again. Finally she broke away and said, "I feel like this is wrong somehow. Robert would be the happiest of all to know you were with me if you could not be with him," he replied, answering her unspoken fear. "I'm not the one who deserved you by any means, but you loved us both, so tell me why this is wrong." She began to turn away, but he pulled her back. "Yes," he said quietly, but with a certain triumph, "I was goading you before it was true. As time went on, though, I began to frighten you, but he didn't. That made all the difference in the world. I overwhelmed you while he made you feel safe. It might have been very difficult for you to live here, but I made it easy, didn't I? I was mean to you. I was a fool. You still overwhelm me. I never know what you may say or do, but I can't walk away from you any longer. Must you always make me admit everything? Will you ever just concede one single battle?" The desperation in her voice finally crumbled his strongest desire to force her to admit he was right. "Forgive me, Kathy. There's nothing more you have to say. You love me. You are here in my arms. Nothing beyond that matters." At this she drew her to him with a force he would have never expected, and he kissed her passionately once more. It was the way she had once pulled him to her when she thought he was his brother, returning late that night in the fog. "My quiet, composed Catherine has another side as well, and it is bewitching." "You must marry me, darling," he said, instantly breaking the spell and hating himself for doing it. "No, I can't think about that right now," she said, turning away. "I have no confidence I could please you for a lifetime. This is just the emotion of the moment for you. You would feel that way with any woman." "You say ridiculous things. You are far more intelligent than that. Why didn't you ever tell Robert about my outlandish behavior?" he suddenly added. "Especially that kiss in the hall when I tricked you so badly. I would have thought at least that you would have made you finally go to him." "No, especially not that," she replied, almost as if talking to herself. "He would have asked me what it felt like, and I wouldn't have been able to lie. Not that I'd have had anything to fear from him regardless, but it was not a question I wanted to answer." "Kathy," he exclaimed in frustration, "don't you want to be my wife? To pledge your soul to me? To have my children? To grow old with me? Don't you want to share your life with me until death parts us? I know you do. Say yes and stop denying yourself everything you want." "Julian, But suddenly they heard a sound from the hall, and Sarah appeared. "Begging your pardon, sir," she said, "but they are asking for you downstairs. It appears as if a messenger has come concerning Cromwell's army and their location. Richard is with him now, and they are waiting in the winter parlour." Julian knew his presence was required, and there was no way around it. He realized that moment was over anyway, and thanked Sarah, who quickly left, showing nothing on her face concerning the scene she had come upon. Julian then turned back to Catherine. "Once again you are saved by a momentary interruption, but we will speak again soon. For a messenger to come this late, we may be exiling to France in a short time, and I will not have this unresolved between us when that happens. You must think about what I said. I will never imprison you, Catherine. Real love is not a prison. You are building your own prison out of fear. You will never be happy without me." He looked at her for a second longer. "You know that." Then he left to meet the messenger. The next evening's supper conversation again centered around the war. Paul and Aubrey Milton were seated at the table with the family at Briarwood. Harold was invited as well, but had not appeared. "Julian, what will become of us?" Teresa asked suddenly. "We must exile to France," Julian replied. "You say it so casually," said Jennifer, as if taking a ride to a neighboring estate. "If I sound casual, it is not how I feel. Yet if we lost the war, we would certainly have no choice." He didn't add that he knew the war was lost, as he felt no need to upset the woman, although he was sure Catherine guessed that it was over. Although Prince Charles had spent a great part of the last autumn and winter in Cornwall, it was rumored that he had now exiled to France. No one knew if this was true. "Cornwall should have been saved," Aubrey said. "We should have struck out on our own." Indeed, many people felt the same about that odd little corner of England, but war's deadly fingers had now claimed its truth. "Stuff and nonsense," Julian replied angrily. "That's been said so many times, yet it is unrealistic." Catherine touched his hand in an effort to keep him from becoming too confrontational, and Jennifer and Richard exchanged a subtle smile at this proprietary action. Julian went on, "This shall soon be a joyless household, with not so much as a fire in the winter. The question that must be answered now is whether or not we want to stay and attempt to feign allegiance to Cromwell and risk death, or continue to send our valuables abroad and install someone here to keep things in order until when and if we can ever return." That night ended on a depressing note, yet no one really expected otherwise, as they knew Julian's words were not merely pessimistic, but essentially prophetic. Catherine was outdoors a few days later, trying to keep her mind off the fate of the country. She brought Robert into the garden, following through with her determination to allow him some fresh air every day, even in winter. As she sat there, she attempted to devise some way to bring the Corinza and Harold back together. She then noticed Reginald at the edge of the grounds helping Rook with some project or another. Catherine could never quite bring herself to speak to him, as there was always a shadow of suspicion in her mind that perhaps he was the one responsible for Robert's death. However, deep in her heart, she still believed the true murderer was her father, and that he may have paid someone to do the deed when he was away from the village and had an alibi. Well, whoever did it may have gotten away with it in this life, but he will not get away with it in the next. She had just returned to her seat after tightening Robert's blanket around him when she heard Reginald's voice. "Begging your pardon, mistress," he said as he walked by, "but Lord Julian is right. He thinks you are too careful of the boy. He cannot be preserved in a glass case. 'Tis not even that cold day today." "He is quite young yet, Reginald," she retorted, and the man grunted in response. Catherine thought what a surly man he was, and that she could never really like him, even though deep down she doubted he was a murderer. She thought how pleased he would be when the Royalists lost the war and he could make it a sin to smile, just as her own father had. However, Catherine believed that Reginald was grateful to still be able to work on the property, and relieved that the suspicion over him concerning Robert's death had seemed to lift over time. She knew he deplored their love of what he would call sinful luxury, and despised Catherine for defecting from a Puritan home, but he admired her love for her boy. "Mistress," he said, I have wanted a word with you about something else." "What is it, Reginald?" Catherine asked. "'Tis about your husband, mistress. Not far from here is the forest where he were shot." Catherine nodded, wondering why Reginald was bringing up the subject, now that fewer and fewer people were of the opinion that he was the culprit. "I never really had a chance to tell you it were none of my doing, the murder, although many people believed it were. I know I said it to all the others, but not face to face to you, mistress, and I wanted you to know I had not done it." Robert and Julian rarely left the manor alone at dusk. "Reginald, I do not know to this day why he chose to do so. There were no witnesses, and we may have to accept that it might never be solved. Well, I just want you to believe that it weren't me. That's all I can say. It weren't me who killed Master Robert." "Then do you know who? It sounds as if you do." "It's not for me to say, mistress. It is for Linston to determine. But I want you to know that I had nothing to do with the shooting of that child's father." "I believe you, Reginald," Catherine said, and she did. Shortly after her conversation with Reginald, Janet came to tell Catherine that Sarah's child had been born. She had a boy and named him Edward, after the man who had done so much to help. He was a healthy, contented baby, and all were happy that Sarah's husband showed no signs of resentment or regret, but seemed quite pleased with his instant family and acted as father to Nathan as well. Several days later, Catherine was on her way to Agnes Gentry's, a woman who was widowed but still made her living from Briarwood by work similar to that which Corinza did in her still room. People came for her remedies and potions, and she had an excellent reputation in the village as well. When the weather was mild, she would make trips to the town to sell her formulas. However, the twins had always especially looked after her since her husband had died, just to make sure she had everything she needed. Luce had found Catherine that morning and said that Agnes was asking for her, but had not said why. Catherine was quite curious, and because it was a sunny day, decided to take a slow and leisurely walk to her cottage to find out what was the matter. The hedges were gay with daffodils, wild crocuses, and lacy cheveril, but Catherine especially liked the giant clumps of yellow gorse that could be seen in the fields. She saw a few squirrels running in unpredictable zigzags and heard the distant cry of a gull. An old friend of her mother's called a greeting at one point, and Catherine had stopped to inquire about him and his family, whom he assured her were doing well. He was a farmer on Briarwood property, and they got much of their wheat and barley from him. As she went on, she thought how exhilarating the breeze was, and enjoyed the way the windy white clouds made patterns of light and shadow on the surrounding meadows. However, there was a second interruption. This one was less pleasant. Lizette had appeared from out of one of the cottages with a parcel in her hand. She pretended not to notice Catherine, which was absurd, as the two had made eye contact. This caused her thoughts to turn again to Carissa and Harold, and she felt certain that the romance was doomed. The thought depressed her, because she knew it was merely due to Lizette's interference, and if Carissa had been a bit more assertive, she may have been able to outshine her foe. She was trying to decide if there were any point in attempting to salvage the relationship, or if Lizette had ultimately ruined what may have blossomed into something greater. Suddenly she heard her name, and was roused from her musings and turned around. Jennifer was coming at practically a run, and Catherine could tell she was breathless. "Jennifer!" she cried. "What is it? Is it Robert?" No, Jennifer said. "Robert is fine. I just came as fast as I could when I found out you were on your way here. I did not even want to stop to have them saddle a horse. You must not go into Agnes's cottage. She has the pox." "The pox?" Catherine instantly thought of Robert and how she could have contracted the disease and taken it back to her child or other members of the household. "But how? Why I was told to come here. I was told she had asked for me." "Agnes would never have done so. She of all people understands how these diseases are passed about. Why would she?" She trailed off, not wanting to voice her fears. Jennifer said nothing, but her fluid changes of expression showed Catherine that she believed someone meant her harm. She even noticed Jennifer biting her lip at one point, as if holding back words she wanted to say for fear of upsetting Catherine. She felt the sudden urge to alleviate some of Jennifer's discomfort, even as she feared for her own safety. "I must have gotten the message wrong. Thank you for coming." As they went slowly back, Catherine saw her companion's troubled frown. She knew that the black fear that had welled up in her was in Jennifer's mind as well. When dressing her for dinner that night, she saw something flash across her reflection in a dark, swift sweep. She spun around, stretching out her hands in an instinct to ward it off, but no one and nothing was behind her. The flight of a bird, perhaps a falling leaf? "I am becoming paranoid in truth now. I must get a hold of myself." She passed a weary hand across her eyes and turned back to what she was doing. Julian was outraged when Jennifer told him about the incident. He questioned Luce, but she was unable to recall where the message had originated, and it had merely been called up the stairs to her, and it was difficult to distinguish the voice. Therefore it could have been any of the servants, and without finding out which one, and no one was going to admit it now for fear of being accused of something, it would be almost impossible to determine if the initial request was brought to the house by messenger or fabricated by someone in the home. The latter was far more troubling to Julian than the former. He even had a wild thought of installing Ernest in the manner to subtly watch the comings and goings of essentially everyone until the matter was solved. "You look deep in thought, my friend," Christopher's voice said from the hall, and Julian looked through the open door of his study. "Christopher, come in. I am just brooding as always on why no one can seem to get to the bottom of the strange happenings. I'm still trying to reason out the shooting incident, let alone Kathy being called to Agnes Gentry's. Although I'm beginning to doubt we will ever come up with any clues. Ultimately, from Robert's death forward, so many bizarre things have happened for which there have never been any answers. Yet the more I dwell on everything, the more hopeless it feels. Do you think perhaps someone is only trying to scare her away?" Christopher asked, not really believing that was the case. Julian thought ironically that led him back to Lizette, but did not think the woman was intelligent enough to mastermind it, at least not by herself. "There are days I try to make myself believe that, but some of these attempts, well, Christopher, we must face facts. They were attempts on her life, not things done merely to scare her." "Agreed," Christopher sighed. "It just feels hopeless sometimes, and one of my greatest fears is that in several months we will be in France without ever knowing who this foe was. I don't want to carry that burden the rest of my life." "No, nor do any of us. Let's just keep watching carefully for anything out of the ordinary and pray that eventually it will somehow be brought to light. Do you know where Catherine is now?" "I find myself spiraling into paranoia whenever she's out of my sight," Julian said ruefully. "She went to Sarah to take something for the baby. Sarah and Catherine had worked on a few warm coverings for baby Edward's crib, as Catherine always thought the servants' quarters were too chilly, even though the staff themselves claimed it was no more so than the rest of the manor during inclement weather. She also made sure to take something for Nathan. When she made her deliveries, Sarah said, "I think I shall be your slave for life because of how well everything worked out for me." "We don't have slaves nowadays, Sarah, and it was not all my doing. Edward clearly wanted to seek your hand and use the circumstances to his advantage," Catherine smiled. "Still, there's nothing I wouldn't do for you. You changed everything for me. It would have been a horrible situation without you to come to, and I certainly never would have had the temerity to broach the subject with Julian. I may have just drowned myself." "Oh, for heaven's sake, there's no problem bad enough for that," Catherine said, wondering if Rosen had ever told her daughter that that was what she had been planning when Lord Justin found her. "We were somewhat afraid it's what you would have done when Master Robert died, my lady. I suppose I can't be a hypocrite and say it did not cross my mind. This talk is morbid. Here, help me with my riding habit. I am going with Carinza for a short jaunt." It was a pleasant day for their ride, and they had veered off through the woods, taking care, as they always did, to avoid the area where Robert was shot. However, at the gate to the Lilac Point path, she stared back at the shroud of trees. Some of the oaks were still quite bare, their branches making an ominous pattern against the sky, and she wondered if the brooding forest would ever give up its dark secret. Catherine noticed that Carinza seemed to have no spark and thought there was something mournful about the wind. She heard a woodpecker off in the distance, almost as if he were laughing at her in a mocking kind of way. Jennifer sought Catherine out shortly after they'd returned. "Since you have been riding with Carinza, I wonder if I could ask your thoughts on something. I'm not sure how far it has gone." "What is it?" "Lizette and Harold." "Oh," Catherine replied blankly. "So there is something. I'm very concerned." "If Harold and Carrie loved each other," Catherine began. "If Harold loved Carinza, I don't believe he would be fawning all over Lizette. I'm afraid Carinza is going to be hurt. This is the first time I have seen her sparkle and come to life since... Well, at one point I believe she very much wanted to marry one of the twins, and as time went on and she realized it was not going to happen, it was as if the inner light that had shone for a short amount of time simply fizzled and died. She never really tried with anyone else, although there was a suitor or two since she's come of age. Of course, she makes so much of the distant relative issue, almost as if she's supplying potential suitors with a reason for rejection before they come up with their own. I was really excited about this romance between her and Harold, as she seemed different with him. It appears he is a fickle young man after all, though." "Do you think Harold ever loved her?" Catherine asked. "I think he liked her very well. I think he felt sorry for her and was trying to cheer her up. Harold always tries to be romantic for the shy violets, but it did seem like it had progressed beyond that." "Do you think it could have been nothing more than gallantry?" "Perhaps. I suppose we'll never know," Jennifer sighed. "If it was, he didn't help her very much. It's no use paying attention to someone for a while and then making it worse than it was before," Catherine said. "Well, it seems he's definitely been persuaded away. I wish he had not taken so much notice of her in the first place," Jennifer replied, and Catherine agreed. "Maybe we should entertain a bit more after Matthew's party, while there's still time. Soon there will be no possibility of a suitor, as we will all be exiles or living under a Puritan facade. For any future gatherings, though, we should not invite Lizette or Harold." Unfortunately, it was too late to change the guest list for Matthew's party, and a few guests were staying over, including Lizette. However, this was mainly to allow the men to discuss the war and confirm their exit strategies. They wanted Paul there for the conversations, and it would be difficult to invite him and not his sister. Carinza retreated almost entirely and only joined the children for Matthew's activities, after which she seemed to disappear. Catherine gave up looking for her and finally went to join the other guests. Sometime later she whispered to Julian that she felt a bit fatigued, despite drinking one of Carinza's remedies that usually bolstered her stamina. She asked if he would mind if she retired early. Knowing it was rare for Catherine to admit to fatigue or give in to the need to rest, he immediately whisked her away to her room and told her he would make her apologies to everyone. Most of their intimate friends knew of Catherine's conditions and were more than accommodating on those infrequent occasions where she had to retire early. Late that night, Catherine suddenly jolted awake from a deep sleep. She had no idea what woke her, whether footsteps, the scrape of a piece of furniture, a brush of air. Whatever it was struck her light sleep, and she became highly alert. At first she thought maybe she was dreaming and had just forgotten the dream, but then saw her door slowly closing. She was determined to catch whoever it was in the act, but as she jumped from the bed, she was aware of a burning sensation near her feet. Looking down in horror, she realized the bed hangings were smoldering and some of the rushes were burning. Grabbing the heavy bed cover, she beat the flames until they were simmering embers. By this time, the smoke had drifted into the corridor, and very shortly there was a consternation in the manor, and servants arrived with buckets of water. The smoke was somewhat uncomfortable and burned their eyes, but the fire was quickly extinguished. "What the devil's going on?" Julian said, arriving just as the last of the water was being thrown on dying embers. "There's been a small fire," Catherine stammered. "In your bedroom," Julian said, incredulously looking from Catherine to Carinza, who had just arrived from the other end of the hall. "Whatever started it?" Carinza exclaimed. "I don't know," Catherine replied as Julian put his arm around her. "Something awakened me." "It does not look like much," Carinza said, "but it could have been a lot worse." Julian ordered the red room prepared and the brandy be brought, and then took Catherine there, refusing to leave her side. The next morning, both family and guests were anxious to discover how the incident could have occurred. "It must have been a candle," Julian said. "It was burning while you were asleep, perhaps, and then toppled over and started the blaze." "No," Catherine said. "The candles were all put out. Some other noise awakened me, and I saw my door closing slowly." "The falling candlestick must have been the noise you heard," Lisette said. "No," Catherine replied. "I tell you there were no candles burning. Some other sound woke me. Someone was leaving the room." "Certainly you are not suggesting it was lit on purpose?" Carinza asked. "I don't know what I'm suggesting," Catherine answered in frustration. "I only know that the blaze was not started by a falling candlestick." "Have done," said Julian. "I will speak to the servants and get to the bottom of it. There must be an explanation." Catherine sought out Luce in the afternoon and asked which of the servants told her Agnes Gentry wanted to see her the week before, but Luce did not remember. "Please try," begged Catherine. Luce did not mention that Julian had already questioned her about the matter when it happened, and thought to herself that if she didn't remember then, she certainly couldn't remember after a week had passed. "Someone called it up the stairs, mistress," Luce replied, "so I'm left with only the voice, which is much more difficult than remembering a person's face. I just can't recall." "It's all right," Catherine said, turning wearily away. Suspicions were roiling in her mind, but there was no person to attach them to other than her father. Nevertheless, even Catherine had to admit that her father could not have crept into the house unseen, started a fire, and somewhat escaped without notice. It was all done carefully, either when she was alone or when there was no chance of anyone catching the guilty party. Life had caught her in a situation that most people only hear about, and she must cope. She must also come face to face with the fact that a person she thought loved her, or at least someone she thought she knew, may actually want her dead. Why would anyone want to kill me? Then she realized the blaze was... And she realized incredulously that it was the first time she had put the question to herself.